Just to contextualize this session, I know we've gone through a couple of GTM sessions already in the past few weeks, but from different angles, from more of a strategy level, people angle, finance, and also sales as well. This time we're gonna tackle it from more of a communications, PR, marketing perspective, right? And we've brought on some great people to share more about that topic, and really in the context of companies that are multi-market and going global, right? To introduce our mentors tonight, I had some questions. Elaine, I want to start with Elaine, as Chawi mentioned, Senior Director of Marketing at Rippling. Rippling, for those who aren't familiar, it's, I believe, a workforce HR platform providing services across different areas from HR, IT, finance, payroll, benefits, all those things integrated into one platform. I'm sure Elaine can do a better job of explaining the platform. But what I wanted to say is that Elaine has had a career in B2B SaaS for global companies for quite some time now, and that's really where her expertise and experience lies. I want to kick things off by asking Elaine what your philosophy as a marketing and comms professional is, especially when it comes to GTM, and maybe that can help our participants better understand where you're coming from and what they can learn from you.
Yeah, thanks, Paulo. And hello, everybody. Really excited to be here today to discuss this fantastic topic in terms of what role strategic comms play in go-to-market. I think for me, maybe just align in terms of what go-to-market is. So for me, go-to-market is more than just launching a product. It's about building the right foundation for your business to actually scale. Now, whether you are in a startup that's finding product market fit, or you are in a scale up that's looking to expand into new markets like Rippling, your go-to-market strategy, I find it has to align like the cross-functional team together across the company, whether that's sales, marketing, product, and it all has to anchor around a really clear value proposition. So for me, I believe a strong go-to-market strategy is equal parts what they call art and science. So the science part is the data, and then the art part is the storytelling. And from the data, that comes from understanding your customer pain points, market dynamics that you actually operate in, and what actually drives adoption for your product. But it's the art, it's the storytelling, or the art of storytelling, that is what's going to resonate with the market and actually make people care and want to buy and adopt your product. So for me, it's connecting the two. And I've seen firsthand, like in my career, how well-crafted like storytelling can actually cut through noisy market, particularly in a market where it's crowded with competitors, like one that we operate in. Whether it's helping a tech company like Rippling scale across Asia-Pac, or it's helping to reposition a brand to capture new audience, or maybe to recapture lost customers. Key is always to anchor, I think, the messaging back to why it matters to the customer and why should they care. And I think it's this approach and this balance that kind of really, when you connect the two between the data or the science and then the storytelling, you create something more powerful, which is around momentum, and momentum that can enable your brand to scale. So that's my philosophy in terms of a strong and effective go-to-market strategy.
I really love that like dichotomy, I guess, with art and versus kind of science of it all. And I wanted for you to maybe contextualize some of the common challenges that you've seen in your career, especially for tech companies, because I know you've joined some of these tech companies in their early days, really seeing them through the learning curve. And what are some of the common challenges that you've seen? Maybe you can park it into challenges when it comes to the art side, challenges when it comes to the data side, for go-to-market and especially communications.
I see Rippling as one of those companies where, while it's really established in the US, but very new, right, in the Asia Pacific region as it expands internationally. So I speak from the experience of somebody who's actually working in one of these startups that are looking to expand into new markets. And I would say one of the biggest challenges that I've seen, and especially companies expanding into Asia Pac, because Asia Pac is so broad, the countries are so different, the cultures, the language, it's all so different. And I think I see that kind of firsthand from somebody, operating in Asia Pac with a US company, is that the assumption that if you're successful, like in one market, like the US, then automatically that should translate right across like to another. But the reality is like every country and every new like region that you're launching into, it's like you're starting up all over again. So you can't assume that just because something works in the US, that it's going to work in Australia. And I can't assume that what works in Australia is going to work right in Singapore. So you need to better validate that demand and really understand the local kind of buying behavior and then adapt your messaging. So the science part is using the data first. So listening to the market, seeing what your early customers are saying, speak to some of the trade bodies, industry bodies to understand like the market dynamics. If you've got a partner ecosystem, like basically do the listening in the market so you can gather that science part to enable you to then adapt the art, which is the messaging, to really suit the local market. So that's, I would say, probably like the biggest challenge is just not making that assumption that you can paint every geography with the same brush. And also, I think when startups look to scale internationally, and certainly because we're in a category that's about compliance. So I say this with the understanding that compliance and regulatory considerations are key. But I think a lot of times when startups actually look to scale internationally, they forget about or they underestimate like how much they have to consider like the local compliance and regulatory landscape, because it's not the same like in every market. Every country has its own set of rules that pertains to how you set up the local entity, how you trade, what your employment laws are, payroll, data protection, privacy laws, like intellectual property, like I could go on. So don't underestimate the compliance part, because that is really key, and that could, if not taken into consideration, could actually set like your business back. So that's probably another area where I've seen like one of the challenges in terms of going internationally. And I think where I've seen like what works best for companies, and hopefully I'm trying to apply this and rippling myself, is those companies that can navigate like those complexities, but in an iterative approach. So don't assume that you can go into a market and you get everything right. Oh yes, I've got all my messaging perfectly, all my channels are all lined up and everything is like working like clockwork. It just doesn't work like that. And you've got to be prepared to fail, but fail fast, and then take the mindset that it's iterative. So your go-to-market strategy evolves. It cannot stay still because it just depends on where you are in that journey of your scaling. So that iterative approach that I mentioned, it's kind of part science, because you're using data to inform where you failed, where you've been successful, and then iterate and then replicate, right? So that's the kind of art and science kind of coming into play. But you know, what I find works is run pilot campaign. So don't launch into the whole market in one go. Contain the impact so that if you do fail, you fail small. But if you do succeed, then you can actually replicate that effort and see how you can iterate and make it better. And always gather like local insights and then just adjust your go-to-market strategy as you go. And I think investing in like building that local credibility early on is like absolutely key, whether it's through partnerships or investing in PR, as we've done thanks to our partner PR group, or just landing some early flagship customers, because these actions will help you build trust in a new market. And trust is everything, because until you prove you understand the market, you cannot effectively sell into it. So you've got to earn that trust, and you've got to show that you understand the local market in order to gain that trust. Yeah, for me, I think the key takeaways is like just balance the local relevance with kind of the global consistency where you can. Prioritize compliance as part of your go-to-market. Don't make it an afterthought. That should be like part of your go-to-market strategy. And test before you scale, iterate, build local credibility. And the most important thing, just listen, whether it's your local team, whether it's customers that you already have or partners in your ecosystem. I think the best insights like always come like from the ground up.
Thanks, Elaine. I have some quick follow-up questions on two of those, actually. On the compliance side, do you have any kind of memorable experience in terms of like where you've had to adapt to certain compliance or regulation in a specific market in APAC?
Yeah, I'd say like Singapore I'll use as an example. Like from going into the market, we know that you can't just send email to to like prospects, right? Because there are laws around like privacy, around having their permission before you can engage. And emails may not necessarily be the best platform, right, to engage with people that are based in Singapore. But potentially something like WhatsApp could work a lot more effectively. But again, it's about understanding, right, what actually works in the local market, and then pair that with what kind of compliance and regulations are in place before you can go and do that engagement work, I think is really key. So that's probably a small example in terms of kind of compliance that we've adapted in our go-to-market strategy as we expand out of Australia and into Southeast Asia.
And in terms of finding balance between the global direction of the company versus having to localize, how do you try not to overdo it in a sense of localizing the message where it doesn't make sense anymore from like the group perspective? Have you had any of those kind of like that kind of conflict or that kind of tension, and how did you resolve it?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question and a very valid one. So I can give you an example from Rippling because it is tough to balance that global consistency with the local relevance in messaging, because especially so, right, when you're scaling internationally in different markets. But I think what I always come back to is you've got to stay core to your value proposition. You try and keep that intact wherever possible. So for Rippling, it's all about helping companies to manage their people operations in one platform. That's our core value proposition. But we have to adapt how we communicate that value depending on the market that we're in. So for example, in Australia, we have many startups, Australian startups, especially those that are venture backed. They are laser focused on global expansion from the get-go, because Australia is such a small market compared to somewhere like the US, where they may be a little bit more myopic and they focus more on kind of the domestic expansion. But it's very different in Australia, where global expansion is kind of like the first thing founders or startups think about, particularly if they're venture backed. So our messaging for Australia, even though our core value proposition is that all-in-one platform, the messaging for Australia, or the storytelling for Australia, is we don't just focus on helping companies with the compliance aspect of managing a local workforce, but also on the ambition of these businesses wanting to scale internationally. So we emphasize how Rippling can help businesses navigate the Australian compliance, but at the same time enabling them to set up for global growth. So that the messaging helps to highlight how Rippling can support companies as they move from local to a global stage. So that's one aspect of how we tailored it. But of course, it's not just about market nuance, it's also about understanding like the different personas that are at play in these markets. So when we talk about an all-in-one platform, the way that we communicate that value is different depending on if we're talking to an HR persona, a finance persona, or an IT persona. And that's where it gets really interesting, because that core message, in our case, is that all-in-one platform. It stays the same, but how we frame it and how we feature it and what we emphasize, it depends on the needs of the different persona. So for example, HR might prioritize employee experience and compliance, so we dial that up. Finance focuses on risk mitigation and reporting and analytics, so we focus on that in our messaging. And then IT obviously cares about integration, they care about security and accessibility to the data. So we focus on that in the messaging, all the while, hitting it back on, this is what an all-in-one platform can help you do. So that's probably a small example in terms of how we stay true to the global storytelling, if you like, for consistency, but adapting it for local relevance.
No, yeah, I was gonna say really hammering down that ICP or that profile that you have for every market, which could be different across markets, help to streamline thought processes and how you want to do messaging. Thanks for all the advice and the examples as well. I want to give you a little bit of a break and move to our second mentor, Joel, who's from PR Group, and introduce him as well. We've been in conversation with PR Group for some time now, as they've been helping a lot of companies here in APAC go global, especially from a PR perspective. And Joel is one of their senior client directors. Joel, maybe you can share a little bit of, given what Elaine has just shared, about challenges she's seen in her own career, maybe from your own perspective, helping companies at scale at an agency, especially tech companies. What are some of the things that maybe these companies don't really miss out on or underestimate when it comes to comms and going global? Because oftentimes communications is not really like top of mind when you're expanding into new markets.
Thank you, Paulo. Hello, everyone. It's great to be a part of this podcast. And to answer your question, Paulo, and I also feel that I echo a lot of Elaine's thoughts already, and some of the considerations are similar. But I will also take a shot at providing some insights towards how startups can solve these problems. So it may be about regional organizations aiming to become a global powerhouse, or just if they are dipping their toes into new markets. Getting their communication strategy right can really impact their success because they need to show their relevance to each of these markets. And if we're talking about key considerations, I would probably start with localization. And when I say localization, it's not just about translating your website or your marketing assets into that particular language, but it's more about adapting your entire communications style to suit the culture of that country. Because let's face it, like Elaine mentioned, what works in the US may not work in Germany, or even closer to Southeast Asia, what works in Singapore may not work in Indonesia or Vietnam. So some cultures value directness, and some cultures value a more subtle, personalized communication. The second aspect of localization is language, especially in a region like Asia with 2000 plus languages. We have seen instances where a brand slogan, if directly translated from one language to another, can have a completely inappropriate meaning. And as a new brand entering into the market, that's something that is definitely not welcome. So, again, the point that I want to make is that we should not translate but localize, work with a local expert, a local partner who can really tailor those key messages to adjust to the local nuances of that culture. Secondly, going back to Elaine's point around regulation and compliance, very much high on the agenda, and the way you engage with your regulators and communicate to your regulators makes a massive difference. And that's particularly true in some of the sensitive sectors such as fintech or health tech, because they're so heavily regulated that any sort of miscommunication in these areas can not only impact your monies, but it can really kill your license to operate in that market. So it becomes all the more crucial for you to make sure that you're proactively building relationships with your regulators, with legal experts in the market, and more importantly, have a crisis plan in place so that when things hit the roof, some clear, transparent messaging and a plan of action will put you on greener shores. So that's number two. The third aspect I would like to touch upon is the customer, because at the end of the day, the customer is king and a massive stakeholder for all of us. And especially in today's age, the customer requires that seamless experience wherever they are. And a service means different things to customers in different markets. For example, in Singapore, we are more used to self-support service. We are more adapted to that direction approach. But whereas in a market like India, for example, you need to make sure that you're making it a lot more personal. You're guiding your customers towards your service value proposition. So that is one. And at the same time, if you're talking about your social media presence, it's not only about what you put out there, it's also about the kind of channels that you utilize to find your customers. For example, WeChat would be more popular in China, or Line would be a popular platform in Japan, whereas Europe or markets like Singapore, LinkedIn is a lot more popular. So the bottom line over here being that we need to find the customer at a place where they are and in a manner they expect us to engage with them. And that's not just in terms of service, but also in terms of support, PR, and also in terms of the entire digital presence. Just one more point that I want to add to address your question around how we balance that global messaging with the local nuances of an individual market. What I can say is that we should think of the brand as a framework and not really as just a message. It should be flexible. So while your core message, like Elaine says, that should remain constant and that should be at the core of everything you do, the channels of execution and the ways that we use to engage with our audiences with that key message should be a lot more flexible and nimble depending upon the cultural nuances of that market.
Yeah, thanks for commenting on all the kind of like topics we had already covered with Elaine as well, and sharing your perspective there. I wanted to ask if you had your own kind of example of kind of a standard or something that our participants here tonight can learn from in terms of really being able to navigate the local channels that are being used, or like the behaviors in a specific market, especially in Asia.
In terms of channels, something that we have noticed, if you're talking about LinkedIn, for example, the global page alone will not resonate with audiences, say, in a market like Vietnam or in Indonesia. So something that really helps is geo-localizing your pages and geo-targeting audiences in each of these markets. Or, for example, having a microsite catered to that specific market, or a separate LinkedIn page with that specific country targeting those users. So that puts into perspective, that shows that we understand the market. We are there to cater to the problems of each of those economies and not just coming in with our global expertise. We understand the problems on ground, and our solutions are really localized enough to cater to all of your problems. So I would say that would be a great approach. And an example that usually comes to my mind, it's not a startup, but a footwear brand like Bata. For the longest time growing up when I was younger, I thought that it was an Indian brand. And then I realized when I met people from other countries that Bangladeshis thought it was a Bangladeshi brand. But it so happens that it is a Czech brand, born in the Czech Republic, formed by three siblings. And every market that it operates in, it functions almost like their homegrown brand. And it's because of the way they have adapted to local nuances, local cultures, languages, and the ways and the lifestyles of the people, that everyone thinks that it is a local brand. So that's a great case study that comes to my mind if I were to take an example of how a brand has gone global, by global, globally local.
I think for a lot of our participants here, and we've been talking a lot about the context of startups, venture-backed tech startups. And when it comes to marketing or comms, it's not usually like the top of mind for budgeting, or there's not often a huge budget for these kinds of efforts. And I remember one of the CMOs I got to talk to on our podcast, coming from, she came from a huge like insurance company, then moved into a startup, and they're always commenting on the budget going from hundreds of thousands of dollars to essentially zero. So what advice would you have for our participants, especially those who are in marketing, but even if they're not in marketing, I think messaging and communication still is an incumbent kind of role that anybody in a company can take on. What advice would you have for them when it comes to being able to effectively localize, again, that messaging with minimal budget? And maybe you have some like creative examples or cases that you've seen in your career or in your industry.
When I started at Rippling, so the way that Rippling structures its budget, it's very much you've got to demonstrate efficacy, efficiency, and we measure that through what we call CAC, which is the cost of acquiring a customer. So we have to hit certain threshold before more budgets are released. So I totally understand and appreciate how challenging it is sometimes, like to work with a small budget, particularly when you're trying to make a big impact in the market. And my advice would be like, one, really understand like who you're targeting, because with a small budget, you've got to be super targeted, and you've got to make sure that when you do hit the target and go via the channel to hit the target, it's got to be effective. Really understand like who your target market is, and can you streamline it down to and fine tune it as much as you can. I think that would be kind of one aspect. Understanding the problem that you're solving in the market, I think that's key for that target audience, because that messaging's got to resonate. So those two things I think are like super important. And then the channel is then where you choose to invest. Obviously, with a small budget, you're not going to go out there and do a big splash on the billboard or take a full page on a key publication. So you're going to think about what are the channels that you can scale quickly. And digital, obviously, is a key one, because you can do that in a super targeted manner, but also enables you to scale very quickly. So that would be one avenue. I would also say that you could be super creative, like in terms of getting to your target audience without always like needing money. So for example, I would say look at look at where your ICPs are, look at some of the things that they've done, reach out on LinkedIn. If you're not on LinkedIn Sales Navigator, you could use your own LinkedIn to reach out. So that's a super effective method, because that will enable you to be super personalized in terms of your outreach, and that will resonate. So that would be one area that we've done, certainly at Rippling. The other one is email communication. So email communication doesn't cost you a lot, but does enable you to scale. But again, you got to know your target audience and the message in order for it to land in a very effective manner. Yeah, so I would say, just sum it up, just know your target audience, be as targeted as you can, know what resonates with them and test that out, because you can iterate, as I mentioned before, and then just refine it to know that what is resonating, because what is resonating is what is going to get you that connection and that response. So you go harder on that if you know that's performing. And then find those low cost channels, and digital, I find, is a great way to get your brand out there without necessarily needing a lot of funds. And then as you have the budget, then you can test out other channels. But in the main, digital would be one. And yeah, utilize AI. I'm not ashamed of using AI in my marketing work, and use AI to help you scale your messaging, give you A/B testing, give you 10 messages that you can test, right? You could do all that through AI without necessarily needing a team to help you do that.
Later, I'll ask about some of your favorite AI tools, and if we can exchange some useful tools for our participants as well.
Sure.
But thanks for sharing that. Joel, any thoughts from your end? Maybe even from I think since Elaine's coming really from a kind of a B2B perspective, any insights especially from the consumer side? Because I think a lot of consumer startups would also tend to, after raising a round of funding, tend to spend heavily on marketing and whatnot, and sometimes not really find it as effective.
Yeah, that's true. And I think we've seen it firsthand. A lot of PR consultancies always bear the brunt of the budget cuts, although we usually advise our clients saying that PR is usually a marathon and not the sprint, and not really a sprint. So even though I'm also a little bit biased towards PR, because I feel I'm in the industry, of course, and I also feel that it's one of the most effective tools in the marketing mix within budgets compared to performance marketing or advertising. So we usually suggest our clients to at least consider keeping the lights on campaign, which means that your name is at least out there, even though your budgets are tight. So they don't completely disappear from the market, which really brings a pause on all of their outreach activities. So these include things like trend jacking, for example, if there is a policy development, if there is an issue. So commenting on some of these, providing your perspective on some of these trendy topics is something that you can do. Like Elaine mentioned, LinkedIn thought leadership is a great way to use that owned asset to build visibility with the captive audience. The third aspect of it, and it's also because PR has moved well beyond only earned media, it's about the power of how we connect you with the right people who can drive growth for you. So keeping that partnerships program on where we connect you with industry bodies or certain communities which have your captive customer base. So to engage directly with them. And that's also an opportunity where customers can directly see the value that is coming into their business from our program. So those are some of the additional suggestions that we usually provide our clients if the budgets are really tight. So keeping the lights on, trend jacking, moving beyond earned media, looking at partnerships, engaging with your communities, and an always on program on LinkedIn.
Yeah, no, thanks, Joel. And yeah, I totally understand coming from the industry, obviously, but yeah, it's also a reality, I think, for startups when it comes to dealing with PR budgets as well. I wanted to go back to the whole GTM discussion and market expansion discussion with Elaine and talk about how do you think about GTM, especially when you're entering a market with partners, for example. I'm not sure if this isn't something necessarily that you've done a lot of in your career, but maybe if you have, maybe you can share a little bit and maybe some other examples that you've seen in the market. Like, how does that differ, say, from example, from doing a more direct expansion or direct launch?
Yeah, I would say when you're looking at a more kind of direct expansion, obviously you have full control of your narrative. So it doesn't mean it's easier, it just means you've got more control of it. So that would be one aspect that differs it to partner, because with partner, you got to find what is that common thing and that joint value proposition that makes it valuable for the customer at the end of the day when the two brands come together. So I think that would be one distinguishing kind of factor to consider. I would say also when you're launching, like in a market, like you would typically like build like an ecosystem, right, around you for launch. You would surround your product or your brand with like media, with influencers, and with partners and also customers. You can validate that offering. Whereas I guess when you're going to market with a partner, as I mentioned, you got to think about what is that joint value proposition that you can bring to the market together, and then why should the customer care? What difference is that going to make in their life to have the two kind of brands that come together? And I certainly find that as we expand like into Asia Pacific regions, like sometimes without having boots on the ground in those geography, it's really critical to have partners because it enables us to scale quicker without having the bodies on in the geo itself. You can leverage partners that already have the expertise, they already have the ecosystem, they've got the network, you're just tapping into it. And then you're leveraging their expertise and their network for you to scale. And that's a really important part of how we think about our expansion, like into Asia Pacific, because we are not going to be in every single market in Asia Pacific. And therefore that reliance on partner is really key. But it comes back to what is that value proposition, like with the partner. I think that is really important, and therefore selecting the right partners for us to go to market with in some of these geos is equally as important.
I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that, especially from a messaging perspective, and how maybe you can share some examples of how you try to marry your messaging with what the partner already has on the ground.
Yeah, for example, in Australia, so we obviously are a workforce management platform. So we provide the software to enable companies to pay and manage their workforce locally and globally. We do have small businesses that come to us and say, hey, but can you also do the actual payroll processing for us, for example, right? Instead of saying, oh, but we only provide the software, like you need someone to actually do the payroll processing. We actually have partners that can provide that service. So basically you can outsource your payroll to the partner, and the partner uses the Rippling platform to process the payroll. So in that instance, the combined value proposition, if you like, is that we can take the pain away for small businesses, particularly for founders who don't have like the bandwidth or the mind space to think about compliance and paying people correctly and spending the time like to do payroll admin. You can outsource that completely, knowing that the partner has the expertise to do that, and then they're using the Rippling platform to ensure that everybody's paid correctly. So that is the combined value proposition between ourselves and the partner, and that is what we put across. And that partner is with us at events that we are in where it makes sense to have them. We provide and we educate like the market together, like through like blog articles, through, for example, opportunities like in the press, like we will put together a press announcement and then see where there's opportunity, right, to showcase that. So those are examples where we've gone to market with a partner and treating them like as an extension of our offering, essentially, to really help ease, right, the admin burden for SMBs.
Yeah, and I think also even from earlier we were talking about budgets, and I think having partners also eases burden as well on budgets as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Because you can look at a joint 50-50, right? In terms of your go-to-market. Yeah, that's a great point.
And I also wanted to talk about, say you're sustaining global operations, right? And say you're already present in multiple markets, and obviously the delivery of, say you have a whole like stack of features, like maybe not all the features may be available in certain markets. Maybe the pricing might be different. How do you introduce like new pricing, for example? I know for everyone here, you might be familiar with streaming services and how they have different pricings across different markets, right? So from a messaging standpoint, from a PR standpoint, how do you manage that, the easing customers into like new pricing regimes, for example, or certain availability of certain features?
I think transparency is key, like just being really clear with the customer base in terms of what is and isn't available. and also what isn't available, potentially what is on the product roadmap, and be really clear when they can expect that. So I think that is like ultimately will help you manage kind of customer expectation. From a pricing standpoint, we always look at, no two price can be the same in different geo because it depends on the market dynamics there. It depends on the competitors that are in the market. And as you said, sometimes certain modules or certain features are not available. So we got to take those things into consideration and then price it accordingly so that we don't price ourselves out of the market, but it's as competitive as compared to maybe the incumbents in the market. So that would be an approach we would take. But I think transparency is always key, just so that you can manage the customer expectation in terms of what is and isn't available in your product suite, which will be different, like from US to Australia to Asia, for example.
Joel, any thoughts on the whole pricing and pricing discussion as well when communicating certain changes or certain differences across markets?
We see that a lot, especially with a lot of inflationary changes coming in. So usually what organizations do is relate back to the consumer so that instead of absorbing the costs. But I think, like Elaine mentioned, we need to own up to it so that ownership needs to come from the company. We need to be a lot more transparent around why are these costs going high or why are they justified. So I agree with Elaine that transparency and ownership are quite important while relaying some of these price changes to your customer base.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to talk a little bit about fundraising and ask you, Joel. I think something at Insignia that we often talk about these days is that it's probably not enough anymore for a venture-backed company to find like a meaningful venture exit with just one market in the region. I think even in Indonesia, unless your market is super deep and the unit economics are super deep as well, it might not be enough if you're looking for a meaningful venture-backed exit. And so there's this drive to really go global a lot more these days. How do you advise companies when it comes to fundraising, especially, and driving that narrative for kind of global expansion? Yeah, to raise money.
Yeah, I think I will take that question from a reputation perspective because I think that's where we usually help organizations build a solid reputation. More importantly, because it plays a real important role in both attracting investors as well as securing funding when companies want to go global. I think at its core, a strong reputation builds trust and confidence, and that's very critical when investors are deciding where to put their hard-earned money. So if a company is known for its ethical leadership, transparency, has consistently performed well, investors consider that as a lower risk and high potential opportunity. At the same time, I would say that reputation impacts valuation of a company as well. Companies with a solid track record can command higher valuation because the market perceives them as more trustworthy, stable, and having a track record of success. This becomes all the more important, especially in a competitive fundraising environment. And when multiple companies are competing for investments, that perception can be a big differentiator because you always, even in a classroom, you always want to associate probably with a good student rather than with someone who always gets into trouble. So you do not want to be associated with a company that is constantly battling PR issues. So there is always that issue of credibility which investors are looking for. Secondly, I would speak a little bit about resilience because I think that there are a lot of challenges. So there are market fluctuations and multiple challenges that companies face during their growth and expansion journey. But I strongly believe that investors stick with companies that have a stronger reputation for ethical decision making, sound leadership, and a good reputation. So I feel that it not only attracts capital, but it really attracts strategic investors and partnerships that can provide longer term value than just funding. And more importantly, I also feel that it plays a great role in building media perception. So any positive limelight in the media also attracts investor interest. But to sum it up, I feel that a good reputation is, in today's world, for startups, scale-ups, and larger companies, it's not just good to have, but it's really a competitive differentiation that helps them attract investors, scale, and go global.
Actually, I was wondering if you had kind of a case study of companies that sort of were able to turn around things because they fixed up their reputation or PR. It could be preferably a tech company or a venture-backed company, but yeah, I'm not sure if you have that in pocket.
Yes, actually, I was working with a cybersecurity company recently. I'm not going to disclose the name, but they went through an issue where a software update resulted in a blue screen of death, where all the systems across multiple verticals went down. So that was a big global meltdown that happened, and that put the company in a really bad position in front of its customers, regulators, governments, because a lot of players were using that software. So that was a clear issue of how a reputation can quickly dilute, and there are certain things that you may not be able to account for, but if you have a crisis communications plan, mitigation plan, if you have done your drills, if you know who your spokesperson are who can face up in terms of this crisis, you can really bring your company back up. So the share value, the stock value of the prices fell completely. But what they did as a remedial measure was a very focused approach on making sure, number one, that they took ownership of the issue, right from the global CEO to the regional presidents. Everyone took ownership, admitted that it was because of them that the systems have gone down, immediately went 24/7 on getting the customer systems back up. So everyone worked overtime to make sure that all the systems that were down were back up over the weekend. And then the constant communication over the next 2 to 3 months was how we are focused on ensuring that our customers are safe, secure. That has always been our goal. They accepted the error and put in a mitigation plan and demonstrated the efforts for that to not repeat again. But more importantly, what they did right was that they safeguarded their customer base, they addressed the issue, they took ownership, and over a period of the next 3 to 4 months, seeded that consistent security first messaging to make sure that their value and their technology capabilities were always up there before anyone thinks of the issue first.
Thanks, Joel, for sharing that almost live case study with our class here. I also wanted to talk about some scenarios, right, that startups, especially as they scale, will eventually face, and then going global. I think one of that is M&A, and as we've seen, even in our portfolio, a lot of them leverage M&A to expand to new markets, because that really softens the landing in many ways and allows them to introduce their services with an existing brand. And then we've talked a little bit about that, especially from a partnership perspective, but how would that differ from an M&A perspective as well? Because that's a lot more structural, more committal in terms of a partnership. What role do comms play there, and how would you think about messaging from that perspective?
Yeah, I would say like with M&As, like comms play a massive role in the entire process. And I've actually been through like a few M&As myself. Yeah, like when Sage, some more stories.
Yeah.
Like when Sage acquired like Intact, and then later on Sage actually divested parts of his business in APAC to Access Group. So I lived through that period. What I would say is through those experiences, like one thing is really clear, and we've got to provide clear, consistent communication, and that's absolutely crucial for both internally and externally. So I think it's important to go, in the thick of things of an M&A, yes, it's easy to focus on what the customer and what the public will think, but I think in actual fact, I think internal comms is probably just as important, if not more important, than the external ones, because if your employees are not on the same page and they're feeling uncertain, then they're worried about their job security, that effectively plays out, right, in the market. And then customers then start to question if their service would continue or would change. So I would say in a situation M&A, like the role of comms, absolutely focus on both internal and external, but I would actually dial up internal and use your internal people to be the mouthpiece to convey a very positive story, right, to your customer and the market. So that's probably like one of the key things that struck out for me, especially when I went through a time where Sage divested its APAC business to Access Group. So there was a lot of uncertainties that you can imagine, like both from customers and also from the employees. So what we did was we just doubled down on internal comms, like whether it was launching like regular town halls, we had like email communication that was weekly, We had impromptu huddles like with the leadership team, and just launching what I call like reassurance campaigns, like for the people like that are working there and for the customers, and just giving a really clear explanation in terms of what's next. And sometimes if you don't have that answer, and it's okay to say and be really clear, right? We don't have the answers, we're working through the details. Like, makes a wall of difference, like for the employees that are there. And I think another aspect I would say is really important in comms in M&A would be the culture, because M&A is about more than just like the numbers, right? Like it's about bringing like two brands, effectively two groups of people together. So whether you're integrating the teams, or like in my case, you are managing a divestment, which is like a separating and effectively like a divorce of the team, you have to maintain a positive culture kind of throughout that transition. Because if you're not careful, you won't have the people left, right, to go through that transition. So during that period, just ensuring the comms strategy highlights the importance of culture just helps to keep, I think, the business together with as little attrition as possible to keep the business operating. Yeah, so that would be the two things I would say is really key. And just like internal comms, super, super important. So comms play a massive role in M&A.
Yeah. A lot of emphasize the importance of the workforce and people and internal comms. Yeah, I think it recalls one of our previous sessions as well from Fave, who talked about his acquiring Groupon as well, and that was also the first thing in the first kind of 60 days, making sure there's clarity about who still has a job, who will be let go, etc. Yeah, definitely important. So moving on from M&A, I also wanted to quickly touch on going public as well. And for Joel, you've talked a little bit about one of the earlier cases that you cited was of a public company. But for those that are on that path to going public, I think for those that are familiar, you definitely want to have a good narrative out there, especially if you're going on roadshows and things like that. More specifically, how early should you already start thinking like of your public markets narrative on that path to IPO?
That's an important, very pertinent question, Paulo. And I feel that we need to take a step back and realize that the IPO process for an organization, it's not just a financial milestone, but it's really a massive shift in how they present itself to the outside world and how the outside world sees them. So communications plays a massive role there, and the earlier comm strategy is integrated into the IPO journey, the better it is. And if I was to talk about it, I will divide it into pre-IPO, IPO, and post-IPO into these three segments. And in the early stages, I feel that the communications function should focus on building a strong narrative. It should be the one that resonates with investors, employees, customers, and the media. And again, this is not only about financials. It's positioning your company as a market leader with a compelling vision and so it's not just the numbers, but really showcase the value of the company through that narrative. And secondly, as we get closer to the IPO stage, the comms team again plays an important role in making sure that the investors are well educated, ensuring that the market understands our value proposition, and the messaging gets distilled across our press earning calls, investor roadshows, and various internal communication activities to ensure consistency and clarity. The other thing that I want to highlight over here is the challenges around media scrutiny that companies face, which are IPO bound. So the moment an IPO is on the horizon, usually there is heightened attention from, say, analysts, reporters, and even competitors. And companies that usually prepare early by setting up, say, media trainings, crisis communication plans, simulations, regulatory friendly messaging, tend to be able to manage their IPO journey a lot more smoothly. And there are companies who approach these things differently. Some usually start at the start a little bit more quietly by strengthening their brand a year or two before filing, and others only ramp up comms, say, after the S1 stage is public. But I really feel that the most successful ones, I would say, are the ones who treat communications as a long-term investment, ensuring that they have complete control on the narrative right throughout the IPO journey before they enter into the public markets. So if there was one piece of advice I would like to give to the community and to our listeners, it would be that it's important to start early, stay consistent, and make sure that all of our stakeholders, including investors, employees, and the media, understand where you are today and where you are headed. So early start and consistency being key there.
All right, thanks, Joel. Yeah, obviously M&A and IPO, they're huge topics, and we could dedicate separate sessions in each of them, but I just wanted to get some insights from our mentors tonight on those topics and how they would think about comms for that. And going back to Elaine, I wanted to talk about, I guess, the comms team with respect to tech startups and how they could better develop either the comms team or even the comms capabilities, right? If they only have one comms person, for example, at a certain point in their journey. Yeah, how would you advise founders and say even like people who are hiring managers to better help develop like the comms capabilities or comms team within their company?
And this point I'm going to make it kind of something you've alluded to already, Paulo, and also what Joe's touched on is if when a startup's thinking about like scaling, I think just one of the biggest missed opportunities is just treating comms as an afterthought. So it'll be like front and center. And I think very often like founders in their early days, I think particularly tech founders, they often focus on product development and then sales, and then they leave everything else as an afterthought. So my advice here is that you need to bring comms and see it as one of your most strategic growth levers for your scaling efforts globally. And I would say if you had very little funds and you can't afford a comms team, that's okay, because you can still localize that storytelling. You could still do like local research, right? Speak to early customers, or just speak to potential like customers, get that feedback, use that data point to develop your narrative and go from there. And you can absolutely get, if you're fortunate enough to have early customers, use them as your mouthpiece, right? Use their story as the localized storytelling that I was talking about. You've got partners, make sure that you get that validation from your partners. You can also tap into industry bodies, influencers. So those effectively don't really cost you anything, but they're third-party endorsements to your brand. That's going to be more powerful than you saying your brand is fantastic. So that would be localized storytelling in a kind of low-cost way if you can't afford, right, comms, because those things don't take a lot of investment. Where you can, where you've got the investment, I would absolutely prioritize media relations and building thought leadership. And that's exactly what we've done at Rippling when we scale from US like into Australia, and we launched 18 months ago. And that's exactly what we did thanks to PR Group, who are our agency partner in this case. So we did that from day one when we launched into Australia. Like we had local research. We were able to provide our own point of view on what those key industry trends were. We were writing like opinion articles, engaging journalists early, and that really helped position our country head as an industry expert. And he's American, but he's treated as, oh wow, like he really understands like the local trends and the key issues that are facing the Australian market. And that helped open doors for a lot of media coverage, but also help us build credibility. And lastly, what I would say about comms for early startup is comms is so important because it helps you attract talent, especially when you're new in market. You have so many people, like incumbent brands that you have to compete with, that you may not necessarily have their brand power because you've just launched. So if you're leveraging comms in the right way, you can not just draw in customers, but it can absolutely help you recruit, right, the best talent in the market. And that's absolutely crucial when you scale globally. And again, it's not things that necessarily cost you money, because you can use your employees or your small team to help be the advocate. Again, use your customers, leverage your partners, use that community to help you build that momentum and drive that advocacy for you. And of course, in the media, if you've got the investment to play there, then absolutely leverage media relations to help you build that thought leadership there.
Thanks, Elaine. I really like what you said about using your customers as mouthpiece. I think one example, like an Intellect mental health company that we invested in, I think they initially started out as a consumer app, but then when they started to launch into like enterprise, B2B, it ended up happening where their consumer users were employees, for example, in these large conglomerates, and they would be the ones to refer it to their bosses or other people within the organization, HR, whatnot, to eventually help get those contracts. I think, yeah, I think that's something that we've seen as well in some of the companies that we've partnered with. For Joel, since I know my question to you was going to be similar to Elaine's, but I think you've been really hammering down on your point about the importance of strategic comms. I wanted to flip it a little bit and ask you what are scenarios where you would advise companies or startups maybe not to do too much media or press or too much noise, right? Or is there a scenario where a company might be doing too much of that? Yeah, have you seen that? And what are there scenarios where you advise startups to maybe chill, take things easy, or maybe focus a little bit more on product and building?
One situation definitely would be, and I think this happens in the startup space a lot, and I've seen that back in India as well, where startups try to bash their competitors. It might be sometimes subtly or sometimes more directly, but I really feel that companies should focus on their own strengths, their capabilities, and not play this public name game or war, which really, in my opinion, does not play very well into their reputation or perception. So that's a clear scenario where startups should probably avoid doing it. Other scenarios could probably be where you do not have the capabilities to back what you're saying. For example, if I would consider a data center player, right? And if they are constantly talking about their sustainability capabilities and them being able to adhere to all of the sustainability regulations around different markets in Southeast Asia, and if there is, and at the end of the year are not being able to deliver an annual report which shows the progress that they have made in a tangible manner, then again it shows fake promises. And they've spoken already so much about it that they're already in the regulator's limelight. A regulator might question, hey, you've been top of the mind or top of the share of voice when it comes to talking about ESG, but if I'm looking at your annual report, you have barely made any progress in terms of your sustainability goals. So talking too much about these things where you do not have the capabilities or you do not have tangible outcomes to show for it when the time is right, that can really impact your reputation and put you in issues territory with the regulators. So that's probably best avoided.
I think it's very inherent to startups because a lot of what startups build is like forward-looking, future-based, may not be there yet, fake it till you make it ethos, right? But at the same time, you wanna make sure that whatever you say to media or put out there doesn't come back to bite you. And yeah, that's something I also share with our portfolio companies, especially when they use future tense in a lot of press, for example, whether it's really necessary. On that note, thank you, Elaine and Joel, for going through these topics with me. I had one more question about how you deal with communications, especially if you get, I would say, like collateral like damage or flack from what is happening in the general market or the general industry that you're in, right? Say, for example, if there's been a crackdown on a certain industry and say media is a little bit more scrutinous on that particular industry, but even if you're not doing anything wrong necessarily, but then you still get a little bit more scrutiny from media just because you're in that industry or related to that industry. How do you deal with more intense scrutiny within a certain industry? Yeah, Joel, you can share your thoughts there.
Usually it is important to have a mechanism to identify negative trends in advance. Media monitoring systems, your media alerts, social listening always puts you in a position where you can watch out for certain trends and prepare in advance for any kind of untoward situations. So that is a mechanism that brands in sensitive spaces, for example, a crypto company must definitely have in place. Secondly, if it still happens, the second part of it would be to have a holding statement in place. This is not to do any kind of proactive outreach, but if any publication has taken your name as a part of the entire industry scrutiny, then we selectively reach out to them to provide them with our perspective or clarification or stance on the subject. So that again goes back to my point around being transparent, taking ownership and acting with speed. And also make sure that, going back to the point around measurement, if you constantly measure whether the volumes are going up, whether the sentiment is constantly heading much towards negative, and then come up with a stronger, more larger contingency plan to mitigate the damage. But Again, preparedness, active listening, measurement, having a holding statement in place, selectively reaching out to those journalists, and then measuring the sentiment would probably be the approach I would take in this kind of a situation. The other part of it would also be to engage with the regulator within that industry. Now, I wouldn't do that always at the first stage, but if the situation is really going out of hand, I would speak to the government relations officer within my team or my organization to try and get a sense of where this is heading, where this scrutiny is being initiated from, and what the regulator is doing to contain the damage. So I would probably activate my government relations team as well in this kind of a situation.
Then for Elaine, any advice you could share in terms of comms for pivots, especially like significant kind of like product shifts? Like for example, if you're moving from like a single service platform to like something more full stack, or if you're completely moving, say, from like platform to private label brand or D2C brand, something like that. Any advice for those kinds of pivots?
Just always be transparent, like with your audience. Explain like why the pivot, because typically there's a good reason, right? Why a pivot has to happen, and then put it in the framework of why that pivot had to happen and why it's important for the audience that you're communicating it to. And if it's a negative impact, then like just be transparent. What is a negative impact? But this is what the company is doing to mitigate it, and this is when you can expect the resolution. But I think, the key is just to always be transparent and explain the why. I think giving people the context to understand why certain pivots happen makes the message much easier, I think, to digest, whether or not it's a good news or bad news, right? I think, those are the two things I would just, always kind of keep in mind. It's being transparent and explain the context.
Once again, thank you, Elaine and Joel.